Good morning, everyone. It is Tuesday, March 4th, and I'd like to convene the Government Oversight Committee public hearing to order. It is 10:10 right now, and my good co-chair is running a couple minutes late, but she said go ahead and start. Um, there's a lot going on in the Capitol, so I'm not going to make too many comments, but just thank you for being here. I'm going to ask my good ranking senator if he'd like to say anything. No, he's good. Representative Carney, would you like to say anything? I think, oh, he's not on Zoom. I will say let's get going then. So today we are going to have four bills for review. House Bill 7090, an act concerning the timing and scope of the audits by the auditors of public accounts. House Bill 7091, the act concerning audits of the energy assessment program for residential homeowners. HB 7092, an act implementing the recommendations of the auditors of public accounts. SB 1408, an act requiring a study of state agencies' response times to Freedom of Information Act request. And we are going to kick off the meeting first, and I have to apologize to one of my favorite former insurance colleagues on the Insurance Committee, Representative Vale, who is new to our committee. Representative Vale, would you like to say a couple words and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Vale, represent Summer, Stafford, Union, and Woodstock. My sixth term up here, and I'm excited to be on this committee. I think it's an important one to make sure we're being efficient and overlooking what our government's doing. So I appreciate you recognizing me, and I look forward to doing the good work.
Apologies for my delay. Thank you, Representative. With that, we have just 6 people signed up today for our public hearing. And with that, we are going to hear from the auditors of public accounts. Would you like to come do a panel or do individually? Great. If you could come up and introduce yourselves. All right, please introduce yourselves and
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee, ranking member Sampson. Good morning. I'm joined here this morning. My name is Craig Miner. I'm the Republican auditor of public accounts, and I'm joined by my Democrat counterpart and longtime associate and friend, John Garagosian. And also with us, we have Lisa Daly and Vinnie Filippa, both deputy auditors. Going first. You're going to go first. It's not what this list says. That's okay. I'll yield to my colleague. He's causing trouble already, Madam Chair. He's making me go out of order. So as long as you recognize that, I see who's first. I'm here this morning, Madam Chair, to testify on House Bill 7092, which I think embodies most of, not all of our suggestions and requests that came out of our annual report. Section 1 in that bill deals with Section 4-40B of the general statutes. And as some of you may know, there are certain times when the governor and the attorney general are required to opine on whether or not a expenditure on the part of the state in excess of $50,000 is warranted, especially if it is intended to be part of an agreement that avoids litigation. We have a recommendation that there should be modifications to that so that people that are resigning or retiring from employment, and there may be a lot of reasons why people do that that never rise to the threshold of litigation, that they should similarly be opined on by the same individuals. Section 2, our audits have on occasion found circumstances where especially in the college and university system, employees of those colleges and universities are doing work for related foundations. In fairness, they're not the only ones that do that. There are other agencies that have foundations that work on their behalf. And it has been the opinion of some that if the college would normally have the employee employed to the extent full-time employment, that any hours associated with working for a foundation don't have to be paid for by the foundation. So in essence, the costs come out of whatever the college, university, or agency would otherwise spend for that employee. Our recommendation is that that should be clarified. There have been some legal opinions, and rather than have us making comment about whether or not someone was reimbursed, whether or not the college or university was reimbursed by the benefactor foundation, we think that should be clarified so that the foundation must reimburse the state agencies. Section 3, recent audits have come up with, let's see, which one is this one? Oh, complaints. Some agencies do a pretty good job of logging the complaints that come into their agency. Some of them do a less good job of logging the complaints. We find that many times we end up with a whistleblower complaint or something akin to a whistleblower complaint because they've reached out to an agency, they've made a phone call, they've written a letter, and then when they've tried to find out what's going on with the concern they raised, no one knows anything about it. And so our recommendation is, in the circumstances where an agency has determined that they want to take that kind of input, we believe that that input should be universally handled. And that is that once it's made to the agency, it's logged, and then there's a way to follow up whether or not anything has ever happened with the complaint or the concern. And we think that would limit the level of angst that the public has with an agency. At least it would be handled similarly across the board. Section 4 is a change that we believe should happen. We generally do our audit of the treasurer's agency without actually direct involvement of the controller. And so there's a way to change. We would propose that the language be changed, removing the controller from the treasurer's audit. The controller has voiced a concern that by being required to sign on the audit, which they didn't participate in, that they're somehow being perceived as being in support of what has been found or not been found. So that would be section 2-90. Section 5 of the bill, Contractor Standing Board, Standards Board. We have a great relationship working with many of our quasis. In this case, there's specific language that says that they could actually enter into an agreement with us to do an audit. And we generally don't do audits of quasis that we audit. I mean, don't directly audit, but audit whether they actually adhere to what they're supposed to do. And so we think section 4E-6, we should eliminate the language that says that they can actually enter into an agreement to audit, for us to audit them, even though they have an outside auditor, as most quasis do. Section 6 and 7 of the bill have to do with contracted audit services. We aren't regularly asked about whether an agency can get their own auditor to do certain auditing functions. But it does happen many times. I was kind of surprised, I think in the first month that I arrived in the auditor's office, that I think there was a request maybe from DESPE. And so in that case, for instance, there's a federal requirement that the state audit how it handles intake and control of their lockup facilities. Our auditors know nothing about lockup facilities. And so rather than have us learn something new and yeah, hopefully not, and having am I right about that? All right. Anyway,
For the most.
rather than have us actually enter into that field of auditing, and there are many other fields of auditing that are similar to that. I think there was a recent request for us to allow for an outside audit of energy audits. And so rather than have our staff go out and climb through someone's basement to determine whether or not someone caulked the foundation the right way, we don't have that expertise. And so our recommendation is that we allow them to continue to get an auditor when requested, but they don't ask us. We don't want them to ask us whether they should be audited. We, of course, would never say that an agency shouldn't be audited for a one purpose or another, especially if there's a federal requirement. And so our recommendation is to have the language changed in 424-215, 216, and 290 to reflect that. And then section 8 has to do with quasis being audited on an annual basis. One of the findings that I remember seeing this year was that quasis weren't always submitting an audit to OPM. And when we asked about that, OPM wasn't sure. I believe this was their explanation. They weren't sure whether the statute intended it to be our annual calendar year, or the quasi's calendar year. And so our recommendation is that the legislature clarify that. So if the quasi's calendar year begins and ends around October 1st, or it begins and ends around January 1st, or if the state's is July 1st, that perhaps if the language just says the audit should be completed within, I think it was six months of the end of whoever's calendar year, whether it's you want to take your calendar year, our calendar year, it doesn't matter. We just think consistently these audits should be filed with OPM. I think that's it for that bill. Want to move on?
Please give all your testimony and then we'll let folks ask questions.
Thank you. I'm here to testify on House Bill 7090. And we're honored that you appreciate the work that our office does and the good work that the auditors do. But we have some questions and concerns about the legislation. First, the new language in Section 1, subsection C would require our office to include a performance examination in any audit upon this committee's request. If that request is for a full performance audit, we do not have the capacity to perform that work at this time. We have 126 people that work in our office, 111 of which are auditors. As of now, we only have 8 performance auditors. And the performance audit work is a little bit different than the departmental audits that you see most frequently, in that takes a lot more planning and due diligence. When we go into audit an agency, we know what we're getting into every cycle. Oftentimes it's the same auditor doing the work, and we have experience with the amount of time it takes to do that work. So these performance reviews are very valuable, and we want to be able to show efficiency and effectiveness, but they take a long time and effort. Now, section 1, subsection D requires our office to provide this committee a proposed audit schedule by December 1st. We have absolutely no problems supplying our audit schedule. However, we do it based on the fiscal year. So we would recommend changing December 1st to July 1st. And obviously, we would share our current audit plan with you. With the caveat, as we all know from working on state budgets, that our budget for audits is subject to change. And there's several factors that affect that. First of all is our federal and financial audit work, which is our real deadline sensitive work. The federal audit is due by the end of March. And we're in the midst of that right now. And then the comptroller's ACFR, we audit that, as well as the financial statements at UConn and the UConn Health. So that is any delay in that causes delay in our other work. When we do an audit, if we find significant control risks, that it adds to the time and effort that it takes to complete that audit. Agency response time. Oftentimes we get delayed by agencies not giving us the information we need in a timely fashion. We usually ask for the information within 2 weeks, and sometimes it's, in some cases it gets to months. So that's a thing that slows us down. Related whistleblower complaints. I can give an example, our first audit of the Port Authority, which was probably about a 500-hour audit. We had a related whistleblower complaint that we probably spent thousands of hours on that. And then we went in and did the second one. So that was something that, would cause us delay and cause us to alter from our budget. Staffing issues, like any other agency, it's often impacted by employee leaves. And, we had one of our supervisors been on military leave for over a year now. And that's one of our lead auditors. So that's affected how we perform our work. And special reviews, most common example, most recent example is our audit of the chancellor's P card. And that audit that review took 380 hours. And that particular review took away from our auditors at the state university system and the work that they're doing. And I mentioned the Port Authority was another example of that. The auditing standards people put forth new standards, and implementation of those standards often takes time and makes us change our entire approach to certain elements of our audits. And lastly, we're going through a migration from a off-the-shelf auditing software to we're building our own system. With that, obviously, we'll build efficiencies and it's customized to what we do, but we found from the past, moving from paper audits to electronic, that the training and implementation takes a while. We'd be happy to complete any reviews the committee is interested in. However, our office doesn't have the resources right now to do those larger reviews. Instead of performing a separate agency audit, we would suggest a timelier follow-up review on some of the significant findings may be a first step to where we want to get. We would also recommend that requiring the agencies to send us all, including the governor and our office and the legislature, follow-up to those findings, and maybe a plan for implementation within 6 months of the issuance of our audit. I mean, it does take the agency some time and to take corrective action, and oftentimes it requires them coming to the legislature for changes to some of our recommendations. We also believe that it create an incentive for the agencies to, comply with some of these recommendations. We do a lot of other work related to, and I interacted with Representative Dathan. For instance, there's another bill hanging out there for us to do performance audits in Medicaid. Now, we spent 11,000 hours a year just on DSS alone in the federal audit, as well as the departmental audit is it's scheduled for 6,000 hours. So we do a lot of oversight there, and the federal audit has very specific requirements of what we look at related to eligibility and subrecipient monitoring and the like. So there is a lot of oversight that you don't necessarily see, because the single audit's about 300 or 400 pages, and it's not a really easy read, but we do, we take that work very seriously. So I'm going to stop here and we'll take any questions you have related to either of the bills. I just wanted to let you know on the last page of our testimony, we did put in a chart of all the hours those are the actual hours from last year's work.
Anything else? All right.
Lisa and Vinny, do you have anything to add that we've? Okay.
Okay, yes, thank you. Just to clarify, your testimony is joint testimony from both
Yes,
of you.
yes.
Okay, yeah, because it just came up on the system as you, John, and so that was when you look at the testimony page.
Yes, I saw that. Yeah.
So I just wanted to, we'll clarify that on our side, so we understand that it's from both of you.
I'm slightly more tech savvy than Craig,
Okay,
Scope.
just a smidge.
slightly.
We're not even going to go there. Great. Well, I have several questions, but I am actually going to defer to my co-chair first to give opening remarks and let her go in with questions, and then I will ask mine.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Apologize for being a few minutes late. I'm coming straight from class. I did have a question. So with the special reviews that you're asked to conduct, how often do you get asked, let's say by year? And what is sort of the impact of that disruption? Because I presume generally it means that all of the other audits will be pushed back a little bit. But how do you sort of manage that disruption if it becomes something that starts taking up, hours that were unanticipated, given the constraints we're already facing?
Well, I guess I would say that, we have the ability, because we do everything in-house in our office. Other state audit agencies contract out for their work. And we have the ability to move people around from various tasks. Often these special reviews are very limited to a certain agency or certain issues at an agency. So they don't happen frequently, I'd say once or twice a year, but some of them have been extremely time consuming. We did one at the lottery years ago that ended up with us testifying in front of the public office of public hearings for hours and all that preparation. And then, so it depends, but the example of the chancellor's review is more limited, right? So that's not that long of a review.
So it's not that disruptive.
No, it tends to be focused on an agency or set of agencies. It's generally, but it's disruptive for that auditor, that instead of doing that, they're working on something else.
And just, sorry, that was your turn. In terms of, given the constraints that you're facing, and maybe all agencies are facing, and it seems like there are dedicated hours, particularly to certain agencies or certain subject areas. Are there other areas that you think have not gotten attention because you just don't have the resources or the time to dedicate to those areas? And what would those be if we were to look into, either agencies or other areas of that haven't received as much attention?
So we speak regularly about where we are with our audits and what we think we see and what we're not really sure about in terms of what we see. So your question, I think, relates to other agencies, and I think we do all agencies. They're every 2 years in general. COVID did cause, and reductions in workforce did cause somewhat of a slowdown there. So some of them stretched, I think, to 3 years, but we're really closing the gap. One of the things that I've noticed is that some agencies, and I'll use the phrase clawback, some agencies have policies that don't allow them to go back more than a year to recover resources that may have been paid out inappropriately. Someone didn't actually meet the guidelines for the grant that they got, or didn't meet the guidelines for the resources that they're getting from the state. And so if we're on a 2-year cycle and they're on a 1-year look back, we've already forgiven whatever's gone out the door for 1 year. That's how I see it. And so I don't necessarily think that we have agencies that we should look at, because we look at them all. But I do think because of these embedded policies, maybe the legislature should look at which areas those policies exist in, and then they can make a decision about whether they think that's appropriate or not appropriate. We show it as a number, we show that it exists, but we can't do anything about it. And I would argue that maybe the legislature, the way it's drafted currently, can't do anything about it. And the other thing is, we never know whether a whistleblower turns into something that we want to really have our field auditors work on. Those are always unknowns. We find it helpful in terms of giving guidance. Sometimes it's over nothing more than a personnel disagreement. Sometimes it's over something a lot more. And so those are areas where we just don't know how much time and energy we're going to have to put into it, but we know they exist, and we know those circumstances in the state exist. And so it's hard to commit resources up front because it could be a tremendous waste of time if you chased them all.
I was just gonna say, we use a risk-based approach when we go in to do an audit. So during the planning process, we'll look at areas that are, obviously we follow up on every single finding from the last audit, but also, look at various sources. Might be news stories, it might be other whistleblowers and other things that we've heard along the way that'll, at least the auditor in charge will consider when they're planning their audit. So they, and if you've tested an area for 3 or 4 cycles and there's not an issue, maybe you do something else. But I think any of the, Lisa and Vinny have done this for many years. I think they would always tell you when they did an audit, they wish that they could have done something else along the way, but we're constrained by the budget of the time, and also, the cycle, the statutory requirement to get these audits out as soon as we can.
That's a really helpful answer. And I ask in particular because in conjunction with the Special Education Committee, questions have come up in terms of their own internal auditing process, and a question of, was there any oversight over these outplacements, given the sort of crisis point that we've reached in rising costs that are escalating beyond what any particular school district is able to be able to expend resources at the local level, including with additional increased state funding. How did we get to this point? And so there's a question about, what did that auditing process look like up till now? And why was there, we have a lot of questions of that oversight, and it seems like there were very few answers. So we're going to follow up on that, but that's why, so I think your point of looking at what policies are in place that have constrained those audits in the first place is something we need to look into, and not just on this committee, but now it affects the other sort of areas that we're looking into. And so that's really helpful. Thank you.
Is that all?
Yes.
Great. I'm going to defer to my ranking member. Okay. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Good morning, gentlemen and lady. Delighted to have you guys with us. Very informative testimony and very straightforward kind of stuff. I mean, it seems kind of nuts and bolts about how to improve the current process that you guys undertake. I want to start by thanking you for the very important work that you do. Obviously, state government is a large, unwieldy beast, and trying to manage it is a difficult thing. And to make sure that we do have some level of oversight, and really, you guys are it. I mean, there's not a whole lot of other oversight over how our state agencies spend the taxpayers' money and manage the resources that they are given. And I find it amazing that you do it with just 126 employees. I think that's remarkable. I have a few specific questions, but just from a general standpoint, I guess something I've maybe pondered about but never thought to ask, which is if you had to change anything about your office, It's the level of oversight, your ability to be more autonomous about what you decide to do on any given particular audit or process. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, I mean, how much of what you do is governed by statute and you've got to follow this procedure, even if something might be telling you to go somewhere else on a certain topic? Let me start with that as a question, through you, Madam Chairman.
Well, I think regarding the departmental audits, we pretty much have leeway. The statutory framework is very broad. So I think we have, some license there. The federal audit is very regimented. The federal government tells us exactly what to look at and how to go about looking at it. I don't know if Lisa or Vinny want to add anything about that from an auditor's perspective.
With the quasi-public agencies, there's a statute that specifies the areas that we have to look at for every audit. And that's payroll personnel, affirmative action, expenditure, surplus funds, and I think financial assistance. So we don't have much leeway when we do those types of audits. For our other agency audits, we do have much more discretion in what we look at.
But, and then the other thing that's changing, like the rest of the world, is the use of data analytics and AI in auditing. And that's the future. So being able to look at large data sets, which we do in some way, shape, or form, but we're getting better in that. And our office has a lot more IT related positions than we did many years ago, because that's the way of the world. And so it's changing the whole dynamics. We can look at an entire universe of something now, which is where, and stratify it, so that's where it's going.
So if I could, to that point, the one caution that I am always giving myself is, just because you see a number doesn't mean it's what you think it is. And so data analytics is one way where we can look at a whole spectrum of payroll or a whole spectrum of expenditures, and you can look at outliers. If we challenged our audit crew to look at that same data set manually, they might choose 25. And you only need to be off in some cases by 1 or 2 or 3, and the picture would change. Where I need to continuously caution myself is that just because the number exists doesn't mean it's been misspent. It doesn't mean it's been misappropriated. It doesn't mean it's wrong, but it actually leads you somewhere where you can actually kind of go through that process pretty quickly. And that's what I think is going to give us more of an opportunity as we go into the future to do even a better job than we already do. We have plenty of audits that have plenty of findings in them for good reasons. That doesn't mean it's everything, and it doesn't mean that we couldn't be more helpful in our response to an agency as to what they should be looking at doing to try and get these to go away. But it's going to take a little bit of time.
Thank you. I do have some questions.
I'm still.
Oh, I'm
I was
so
just
sorry. I
giving
thought
you
you.
recognized that.
Oh, apologies. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm old school. I like to go through the chair. Thank you very much for those answers. They're very helpful, particularly about the quasis. And certainly, I would love to, interact with you as much as possible. If you think there's something we need to add to this, or I want to give the auditors the biggest toolkit that you need and whatever resources. I know that, budget time comes around and, everybody's looking for funds for their state agency and whatever projects they have going on. But I think it's absolutely imperative that we maintain oversight over the taxpayer's dollar. Just, again, I'll go back to how amazed I am about the whole thing. I mean, you mentioned the P card issue taking 380 hours. I mean, that's a significant amount of time. And for a limited number of staff, it's the more incidents you have like that, obviously, the more it shows that there is a requirement to have the proper amount of staffing. And very interested in the technology aspect of things. I'm just beginning at my learning curve on AI. myself, and completely impressed with the capability of the technology, if it's used correctly, of course. I wanted to ask a couple of just very specific questions with regard to some testimony we got from some other folks. The airport authority submitted some testimony regarding Section 8 of 7092. And they're just asking for a date change for the reports that they are being requested to provide. Just curious if you've seen that and if there's any objection to it.
No, I think that's what our testimony kind of said, because they all have different, well, I don't know if they all have, but some of them have different dates, that rather than putting in a date certain, then base it off their year, their fiscal year. So that's kind of what, in conjunction, what we say in our testimony, we understand, and that's what that was our intent.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate that. And then also the, I think it's DAS, had some concerns in 7092 about the complaint process. I enjoyed the part in the testimony where you mentioned certain state agencies that don't accept complaints. That's me too. I don't accept complaints either. But they bring an issue up, basically saying that a lot of state agencies have their own process, and they're averse to the recommendation that state agencies develop, via our request in 7092 to come up with a, kind of a standardized process. Just wondering if there's a reaction to their testimony, just so we know what to do when we go back to the drawing board. I'm inclined to side with you guys, just so you know.
I think, yeah, there were a few audits that we've had where we've encountered it, where there wasn't necessarily, they weren't monitoring the complaints. They weren't necessarily keeping track of their investigation and resolution. Didn't mean that they didn't necessarily conduct those things, but they didn't have their arms around it, because we think if there, you might find some pervasive issues if you are tracking that information. We didn't necessarily think this had to apply to every state agency. There's only certain state agencies, and I don't want to, we've had a few agencies, but we'd be happy to talk to the Commissioner of Administrative Services and kind of discuss that issue with her. So, yeah, I understand her concerns. I don't think it applies to every state agency. I'm sure but I have to say that we did find some agencies that weren't doing a great job in this area. So, so hopefully we can focus on those.
Thank you. Senator Sampson.
Thank you once again, Madam Chairman. I appreciate that very much. One of the reasons why I asked the question is because, this happens. Obviously, we get, your testimony, we've got the bill we're working off of, and then gradually when we get feedback. And I just know from experience, certainly in the GAE committee, we have a bill every year about quasis and oversight, and it gets picked apart down to it's not even worth doing anymore by the end because of all the feedback. And I'm inclined to defer with you over any of the agency's concerns over these things, because that's just who I am, I guess. But I just wanted to make sure that you have an opportunity to respond to their concerns. And with that, I'm through. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Sampson. Thank you. It's really great for you to be here in person and sharing your testimony today. I wanted to echo my support of looking at the whistleblower complaints and how you have proposed to put that forward. I think, oversight needs to be at all levels, and I think this provision ensures that we have oversight, and there's an opportunity for people within to be able to utilize process complaints, track things, and make sure that things are going smoothly. Along with 7092, you had talked about that you wanted to remove the comptroller from participating in annual audits. And I read your testimony on that, and I was hoping you could elaborate more, because my feeling is, the comptroller does also provide some sort of oversight in ensuring that where we are financially, everything kind of works together. And in my opinion, it would remove silos to make sure that the communication's happening. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on that for me?
That change is just limited to the treasurer's report, where we basically do the work and the comptroller doesn't, but they're required to kind of in statute participate, although they don't. They have indicated they're supportive of this change. But you can obviously ask the comptroller. I mean, it's just very limited to this one issue. And do you guys want to?
Sure. There's a statute that requires us to audit the financial statements that are included in the treasurer's annual report, which is due at the end of each calendar year. And the language in there just requires certification by both our office and the state comptroller. However, we do the audit independently. They really have they're not involved in the audit in any way, but they do sign it just so that we're following what's in the statute.
So my only question is, if it isn't the comptroller that certifies it, who else outside of your organization would certify it from the executive branch?
It really should only be our office because we are independently completing that audit. So normally, no one in the executive branch certifies our other audit opinions either.
So in terms of the relationship between the comptroller's office and the treasury office, my understanding is we want to make sure that there is communication on things that are being reported. And, my concern is, we have the interest, for example, that we didn't know about. And if, there was, within the audit process, something like that might come out, and this communication and signing off by the comptroller might facilitate those sort of issues coming up. Are you aware of anything like that that would be able to facilitate kind of oversight on things like that?
Well, I would say that a lot of what we audit as part of the treasurer's annual report actually gets rolled up into the ACFR. So at that point, the comptroller's office should be reviewing the treasurer's figures anyway, but it is separate from our review.
Okay. I appreciate your testimony. I'm going to think that one through a little bit more. In terms of the Section 5 in the same bill, the State Contracting Standards Board, we have triennial audits over state contracting agencies. Is there any materiality threshold involved when prioritizing such audits?
From our perspective or the
Yeah,
perspective?
your perspective when you were planning out your annual audits and you're looking at agencies that have contracting abilities, is there a materiality threshold involved in prioritizing certain audits over other audits?
Not within, you're talking about the departmental audits. And we look at contracting as part of those audits. And, obviously, if you're talking about the Department of Social Services, which has many contracts versus the Department of Insurance, that probably doesn't have a lot of contracts, it's different. So it's something we obviously consider. And obviously the procurement methods and adhering to bidding and the like. There's a new requirement that agencies are supposed to post with the Office of Policy and Management, any contract they intend to sole source. They're supposed to put forth a 3-year plan, and obviously we also consider that.
Okay, that's helpful. The one of the other questions, first of all, I should have probably started, we talked about in another committee about human service audits. And I know on our Human Services Committee, we talked about 1122, and that bill is getting JFS today. And I don't know if you had a chance to look at, understand what the S language is being contemplated, but it is looking at a kind of streamlining the number of audits that are done, and choosing 2 Medicaid audits that would be done kind of like an annual basis. Just wanted to kind of get your sort of feedback on there, because I do know that post my discussion and your testimony last week in that public hearing, that the DSS audit is nearly at completion, and we have a number of years, and you do several performance-based audits, and was hoping you could just kind of talk that through with the committee today.
Kind of reiterate the testimony from before. We have 8 performance auditors. So to the extent, and they're already working on several audits that they're starting. So we tried to figure out what resources it would take to do the audits in the initial bill. And it would take the hiring, basically almost doubling our performance audit unit. We priced it out at 6 new employees. And even if we hired them tomorrow, we probably wouldn't have work product for a year to year and a half, as I said, because without knowing the objective and the scope of those audits, we can be looking at 3,000 to 5,000 hours for each of them. So, I mean, I think that what makes sense is to sit down with our DSS auditors and our supervisors and have a discussion about what we're trying, what the intent is of these audits and what we're trying to achieve. And maybe we can narrow it down to something much more focus on something very narrow, but also it may be an area we already look at. Because
Right.
like I said, 11,000 hours on the federal side, 6,000 hours on the departmental side. And then, so we do a lot of work in that space.
Totally. And I appreciate everything you've done. And I really appreciate that you kind of clarified how long all of this takes. And it was, I hadn't quite appreciated when we spoke last week in our hearing. Maybe one of the questions is, in terms of performance audits, is there a way that we can say, we have limited procedure audits over performance, in terms of focusing on certain aspects of a program, so that would limit the scope of such performance audits, so that we get the data that we need to get for our programming, but also realize that we're not, rehashing everything. Is that something that you all would consider as part of your performance audits? Or are you kind of hesitant to have people dictate your scope of an audit that you would do for performance basis?
I would say that we would always be open to suggestions. Again, I'm still learning. And one of the things that I've learned is sometimes my bright ideas don't actually manifest in kind of an audit or the potential of finding a problem or resolving an issue or whether we actually are meeting a goal. And so kind of with that caveat, we do have people that are very thoughtful, very inquisitive. And so if we say to them, in the area of special education, how do we know that what we're paying for special education isn't too much, isn't enough? How do we know whether the outcome of special education is what people at the local school system thought was going to happen? Do we have any way of gauging that sort of activity? And so there are subjects that lend themselves to performance audits. There are probably some other things that, even though I think they're, something worth looking at that way, they really don't lend themselves to a performance audit. But I think that kind of dialogue would be very helpful for us. And the ideas run the gambit. So if the committee wants to focus on certain aspects within social services, or pick the subject, as long as there's an understanding that just the fleshing of that process out takes some time before you even know whether it's going to bear fruit. it's sometimes we set these goals and these dates, and I probably get as frustrated as anybody, but I am learning that there's a reason why I should be frustrated. Frustrated meaning that I should be understanding that it's not just my way and it should happen within 2 months. Because it is quite an experience. And for you folks, I think it would be quite an experience to maybe come up with a subject matter and see how long it takes. We worked with the legislator last year and didn't get to the gate finally with what I would say would be an agreement, but it was kind of last minute. But it's definitely subject matter that we should be looking at. I think John and I both agree.
Yeah, I mean, it's our goal, obviously, and it's a struggle to come up with topics that are going to be of value, right? So that, and you have to have a lead time of a year or more, right? So that we're releasing audits that are of interest to you, are interest to the public. And it's one of the most difficult things in terms of doing this. We want the audits to be impactful. We don't want them to be released and just kind of go up into the ether. But like I said, it's a different animal in that they take a lot of upfront planning time, and we just got a couple of topics in the last week or so. And sometimes you do some due diligence and you find out really it's not really worth pursuing. And it's good to take that off ramp rather than going into thousands of hours. The two most effective audits that we've done in that space is, well, regarding special ed, we do these special education audits. And I think the next one's going to be looking at a little bit more about municipal oversight of whether the children are getting the services they need and whether the municipalities are getting what they're paying for. But one of our early special ed audits changed the way that the contracts are composed and also the documentation standards for private special ed providers. And that was a very effective use of what I would say a performance audit. The other one that comes to mind is the VEO audit that we released years ago. And that audit had 15, and that was through a legislative request, Representative Abercrombie at the time. And that audit had 59 recommendations and 54 were implemented within a year, either through contract or through a law change. That's what I want to see. Does that always happen? No. I mean, but.
Well, that's actually was one of my questions today. Do agencies that receive comments, sort of suggestions and recommendations, do they report back to you within a certain time frame? Because sometimes our audits are multi-year audits. Do the agencies have to report to you their status of implementation of the recommendations in any sort of cadence?
Well, we follow up on every audit for the recommendations. So for instance,
Do you wait till the next audit or do
Right.
you do it in the interim?
Well, in the next audit, but in the case of DSS, I think we're going right back in after single audit gets released. So we're going to release I think it's 22, 23, and we're going in for, is it 24, 25? Like right now, like soon thereafter. So part of that is you don't want to do these audits too soon, but you don't want to do them too long, because if they did, if it's 3 years behind, they say, well, it was the other administration, the other commissioner, but also you have to give agencies time to, take corrective action. And oftentimes, some of these audits take a while. So they are taking corrective action as the cycle goes on, as it goes through our management review. Because some of them are very lengthy. Some of them they're not. I mean, we've released a lot of audits recently that have absolutely no findings. And we're happy to see that, too. So.
Exactly. I think, especially for some of these material agencies, I think a lot about materiality. And so I'm thinking, okay, are we taking corrective action? Is it in progress? And that's fine too. And what is the sort of status? And I think that's kind of what I'd like to understand, and really some of the goals when we look at the sort of timing and scoping of audits to make sure that we are, getting those recommendations are being followed up on and being implemented as appropriate.
So what I've become more appreciative of is what I would call the back of the audit, because it actually does get into that kind of a conversation. If you kind of follow the tracking process, there's the recommendation, then it actually describes the cause. And then it gives the agency an opportunity to opine on whether they have work in progress to try and fix this problem, or whether they're kind of jammed up because they're looking for employees. COVID becomes the excuse for a lot of things, but the reality is that, having served in the legislature during that period of time, the governor and the legislature relaxed the rules on contracting. You brought up materiality. Well, materiality, but for the fact of COVID, people would probably be much more antsy about extended contracts than they probably have been over the last 2 or 3 years, because those contracts may have been for a period of a couple or 3 years. And so they've kind of flowed one into another, especially when they're specialized work. The farther we get away from the COVID window and we no longer have those opportunities to get around statute without going directly to OPM and saying, this is what we need and this is why we need it. I would hope that the legislature would be looking at those situations and try and engage the agencies in a conversation about why are they still doing it that way, to your point about materiality. But aside from that, I do think that if you look at the responses from the agencies, you can get a good sense of whether they agree with the finding, and you can get even a better sense when they do agree what their course of action is going to be. To your point, and I think our recommendation was that maybe there should be some requirement that they at least address it within 6 months. Some of these findings have been going on since 2012, 2014. And, I keep thinking, hello, is there anybody in there? And it's like, I understand. And whether I want it to be the case or not, I do respect the fact that the Department of Children and Families, I'll just use them as an example, they have an obligation to their core mission. All these other responsibilities are responsibilities in fulfilling the core mission, but I think they would argue to you and they do to us. When I wake up in the morning, I'm really not all that concerned about whether I got my paperwork done in 1 day or 7 days. What I'm concerned about is whether I left some kid somewhere that we shouldn't have left them. And I think that's a reasonable response. But the fact that you have the dialogue, I think is probably helpful to us, because our auditors go into these agencies respecting the work that they do and come out there since 2012 with the same finding.
I'd have to say there are, I mean, the caveat to that is, like, for instance, we released the Department of Correction audit, and this is true of public safety and healthcare atmospheres, environments where, they're going to have issues related to documentation over time, almost every audit, because their main thing is getting the corrections facilities staffed and the short notice. So I guess the measure there is, are they getting better at it, right? Is there more documentation?
Or what controls are they putting in place to manage it? And is it authorized? Is it, how are we having oversight over the fact that there is overtime, for example? I think, I want to call you Senator, but Mr. Minor, we have a good, description of how you're following up, but there's, like you had said, that there are several things that aren't being followed up on. The Government Oversight Committee has an opportunity to bring those folks in front of us and say, hey, we'd like to understand how you are, resolving some of these recommendations that have gone on and on and on, or how are we having oversight over that? So I think that's one of the sort of compensating controls in place that we have here. But it's also good to know that, if there are things that are dragging on, that we can follow up with them on a regular basis. I think, one of the things I'm looking at with 7090 is maybe not necessarily having language regarding performance examinations, but maybe a limited procedure, an agreed a limited procedure audit, or performance basis so that we have an ability to manage it. So we're not overly taxing your 8 performance auditors, and we're looking at things on a more limited basis, if you will. I think that might be something that would be useful and be able to have that. I think having a schedule would be super helpful for our committee, really. So we prevent I need to call you and find out where we are with certain audits, or if I know an audit is coming down the bend soon, and having that understanding, like DSS. I understand from the agency that you all have teams in there basically 12 months a year. And so it is something that's constantly being looked at. I remember with the VAO example with Representative Abercrombie, that was something we talked about in MAPOC extensively. I think it was in 2019 or so. And so that was really useful. Your testimony has been great, and I just had one other sort of question. I don't know if you had a chance to look at 7091, which was the audits of the energy assessment program. Now, these are we're asking the board to issue annually to the Department of Energy Environmental Protection a review of activities by the Connecticut Green Bank. Is that the Connecticut Green Bank as a quasi? Is that something that's in your purview? And how often do you do audits over that agency?
It would be every 2 years, like the rest of the quasis. I think we released one in the last year or so, or maybe, I don't remember, but yeah, I mean, and I recall it didn't have any finding. I don't think it had any.
Yeah, I don't remember it sticking out in my head.
Yeah.
But in terms of that procedure that you all are doing, are you having a look at the program for the energy assessment program as part of your procedures?
As Lisa mentioned earlier, for quasi-publics, we kind of follow what's in the statutes to review those. I think it's 8 different requirements for quasi-public agencies. We don't take a much deeper dive into programs like that.
So not necessarily a performance audit for
No.
them. It would be strictly financial statement audit.
Correct.
Okay.
Unless it's determined to do a performance, and I think we have the authority to do so, but we haven't.
Okay, so there's opportunities within the quasis to do, again, I'd like to see a limited procedure type examination that we could kind of figure out how might work for some of these organizations.
So could I ask, is the
Absolutely.
word entity used in that audit? Did I read that right?
Such audit. I don't see it. I'm just gonna defer to LCO actually.
It may have been a different one. And so my question when I read that was, is it intended to mean part of the quasi, or is it intended to mean a contractor that may be paid through some service agreement with the quasi? And once again, I don't know how deeply you would want our audit to be. In theory, if we were going to actually go in and look at the books of a company that was doing work in an effort to achieve the kind of performance evaluation that you might be looking for, that would be way, way deeper than we currently look at that program.
So how I would envision it, and without kind of a deep knowledge of these, that as part of the audit procedures, you review contracts and you review certain milestones that contracts are to be had in order for them to be paid, and their milestones have been achieved. And I think what we're trying to understand is, accountability over these home energy assessments that are being done, and how that is being managed by the quasis themselves, not necessarily the contractors who come to your house and do this, but understanding that our quasi is looking and having oversight over those contracts and their performance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think we didn't offer testimony on that bill without a clear
Right.
scope and objective. It's difficult for us to, and what Craig was asking about it, wait, does that mean going out and auditing entities? I don't even know. Oftentimes, like I know in some of the human services, there's a vendor, there's a third party that does some of the oversight of these other contracts. I would call them subcontractors. So I know we encounter that in single audit all the time. So I'm not sure, and we'd have to dive into what this was and what we were trying to achieve. And I think we can, if it was limited, maybe something we could do.
Yeah. I think the one kind of concern is maybe not doing it quite so soon and giving ourselves a little bit more time to really understand how those transactions work, and how we can get a little bit more accountability and oversight over them.
And we can try to do that on our end too, to just figure out, which is what we do, anyway, but to figure out how it works and who has oversight responsibility in the case of, contractual process, making sure that things get done, and how they verify that, I'm not sure at this point, but we'll try to find out.
Okay, that's really useful. Anything to add on that one?
Yeah, the only thing I was thinking is it depends on the level that we're looking for. And you mentioned oversight, and we'd have to look, as John said, we just have to consider whether there's anything that we don't have the expertise on and that sort of thing.
And that's always the difficult part of doing performance audits, because your team of 8 has to kind of be the jack of all trades that understands that. And really how, I guess, part of the issue is understanding what the sort of controls that are in place to manage the performance that the agency oversees. And I think your responsibility as auditors is really understanding that cycle, is what I have gathered from reading your performance-based audits. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, and I'd say, yeah, in the case where we don't have the expertise, we rely on, other benchmarks that are out there in terms of staffing levels, in terms of other things, accreditation agencies, or whatever else it may be. But we've often, the team does have a lot of different experience. And we used to have a PhD that had a healthcare and social services background, who retired. But, so we try to balance that. But you're right, we're going to encounter audits where we can't tell you, like in the case of special education, I can't necessarily tell you. We can tell you if Johnny had his speech therapy. Now, the next step is he doing better? So how do we measure that? So we've often talked about reaching out to experts to kind of bring them into the process. But, obviously that takes money too.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's helpful. The last thing I really wanted to understand was your new software that you referred to in your testimony. I think that's super useful. I know it's come a long way since my auditing days when I was on the rollout of Coopers and Lybrand's class system, they called it, and was one of the trainers on that in the San Francisco Bay Area. And auditing software has changed dramatically, and having something specialized is great. What is your sort of timeline for getting that completed, and what sort of efficiencies do you envision? Is it, turnaround time of audits that you see is going to be improved, or helping managing staff shortages?
I'm going to let Vinny talk about this more, but I mean, when I first got here, we were doing paper. I'd get an audit thrown on my desk. I couldn't get it. I couldn't see the
Tick
work,
marks and.
the work
yeah.
papers or anything, and I have to call, and if the auditor was at UConn, they have to, figure out a way. We've had this software system for about 10 years now, maybe 12 years now, I think, which is, integrates, I can see every work paper in the binders. This is going to integrate everything else. We have an intranet system that does a lot of our personnel things, policies, and everything else. It's going to be one. It's a SharePoint platform. And we went through the RFP process to look for new auditing software, and we came to the realization we could develop our own. We brought on a consultant to do that, and it's going to be customized to exactly what we do, including whistleblowers, engagement letters, everything within our system. So we're kind of melding our intranet with our software platform. But Vinny's going to tell you when we yell at him all the time about getting it ready. No, we want to get it right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think John covered most of it, but essentially, we were working with this off-the-shelf product for a number of years, 12, 13 years. It's easy. It works well. There's a lot of flaws, and we went out, we submitted a questionnaire for the office to see what types of flaws it has. So initially, like John said, we did go out and look for a cloud-based product. One of the other issues with the current product is that everything's going cloud. A lot of those the former products are being sunset and are not getting the support they need anymore. And it's not to mention it is a costly thing. So we did initially go for an RFP, and what we were finding is that a lot of the auditing products are costly, more than we could afford. And there were some barriers to going the way we are, but we overcame them. And SharePoint allowed us to build out a customized product that meets all the standards we need and build the workflows. So what it's going to do is we built out we already we're in process now in implementing our workflow for our departmental audits, and this is going to be rolled out most likely we'll be going to start by April 1st. So the departmental audits should be able to start migrating, beginning on that platform now. And in the meantime, we're building out our other workflows and hopefully get those done by the end of the fiscal year for our ACFR and single audits. And then, and it's going to be unique workflows for those. And we also plan to do it and incorporate a lot more for our whistleblowers, including the intake of them through our reporting to the Attorney General's office. So it's building out a lot of the customized workflows through the system, and it will integrate with a lot of our other our intranet and other platforms we use.
That's super helpful. So will there be, since it's an internally developed software, what sort of oversight is there going to be to make sure that it's working? I know in my day, they used to call them SAS 70 audits. I don't know if they call them anymore. But is there going to be sort of a report that the software will adhere to make sure that it's working appropriately because it is internally developed rather than something that is done by off the shelf or through a software?
I think those reports are more for like outsourced functions, correct?
And you're going into the deep hollows of my old self. I know that when you have an internally developed software product, a financial internally developed software product, or an audit based, you have to have some sort of report that is done that kind of manages that and ensures that that software is working to what it's supposed to be doing. I can't remember the number of it. I was using SAS 70 because I thought that was the name of it. But again, you're working 30 years ago for me to remember.
Understood. So we'll look into that. I don't know if we should seek a report of the system, but one of the things is we do have our peer reviews every 3 years. Our audits are intended to meet auditing standards, and we're making sure that the system accomplishes those, much like our current system. So we looked at the current system and looked at new standards that develop and incorporated that. But our peer review is certainly going to be examining it.
That's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up to refresh my mind on that one. In terms of other states, do they internally develop their software or do they buy things off the shelf?
Most are going to be off the shelf. We did meet with, I believe it was Arizona. They were using SharePoint for a number of years now. There's at least one other state that has done that, but most are off the shelf. And most have migrated to a cloud product though.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
I was just going to say our peer review is this summer, so we have 4 or 5 state auditors coming in and a federal. So if you want to,
I
See how
can't
that-
wait.
yeah, we can't either.
Excellent. Well, that's all for me. I do have my good co-chair, Senator Guy Wilcox.
Thank you. Just 2 more questions that came up. When was the last time that special education audit happened, and sort of what precipitated that for the performance review? What was there a question about the contracts, and were there other areas? It's just I'm raising this because there were so many concerns about not only sort of what would the oversight on particularly the outplacement services and the cost and the rising cost, particularly in the last couple of years. But then also there was testimony before that some state dollars have been, in fact, given to private institutions that don't even that are not even approved by the Board of Education. So, are there any sort of numbers on that? And that was through due process settlement. And so there's just a number of questions that have come up as to whether or not there was oversight on that, like how many times did that happen and how has that all been tracked? So just curious about the previous times, and do you think that another sort of performance review is warranted now?
Well, our audits of special education providers started as a result of, I think, the Moore Commission that former Speaker Sharkey was involved in, and that so it developed into an examination of initially they wanted us to audit every single private entity, and we just didn't. Again, it became a resource issue. So we've issued, I think we're about to issue our 5th report, which I think has 5 or 6 schools. We've done those, but we also had some initial reports, which I can get to you. It had to do with the State Department of Education's oversight and monitoring of some of these entities. But so we had that change that what we found initially is that they were using the IEP as the contract. And an IEP does not have all the elements of a contract, right? So the cost, whatever the terms, and the more you have a contract spelled out, the better it is for both parties. So that was one of the changes. And the other big change was requiring documentation standards for the services that were performed. And so what happened with COVID and everything else, I forgot exactly. I think that law passed in 21, but we wanted to give the providers a chance to kind of catch up, and we wanted to go in and see if they were adhering to the new law. And I think for the most part, they have been. We're seeing contracts in place. We're seeing documentation of services. One of the flaws is, New York has a model where they have approved costs. So
That's what I was going to, okay.
for-
We have
and that's-
documentation,
and
but
we-
no
Yeah.
approved costs. Okay.
And
right.
we don't have that model. So one of the things that we've been asked to do is it appropriate? Well, the way we operate is we operate by the criteria. What's the measurement? And without that framework, it's difficult to say this is inappropriate. And I know one of the issues that's come up is the profitability of some of these entities. Well, unless you say they can only make 10% or, whatever the profit margin is. But I really wanted to look at from the other side are the municipalities following up and making sure they're getting what they're paying for? Are the students getting what they're paying for? Is there some way to measure that? So obviously you have to start with something that's more apples to apples, right? I mean, in the sense of some sort of reading therapy or something, and see if the student's doing better or something like that. But we're just in the planning stages of that. We're about to release, I think, our 5th special ed audit soon. I don't know where that is, Lisa, but I've heard it's on its way. So.
Wonderful.
but
And if you
obviously
could
if you
send
wanna
any
talk-
previous,
Yeah,
that would be great.
but obviously if you want to talk about this more in depth with some of the people who have done the work or do the work, we can.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I'd be very interested in that. Thank you. Because there's a number of those questions have come up. And then I just had one more question about your recommendation here, that you said that, certain agencies are not maintaining records of their complaints, investigations, and resolutions, and that your recommendation is that we consider requiring them to develop and implement some kind of complaint processing procedure. But then you're recommending that only for agencies that regularly receive complaints. So how would you classify that? What does it mean to regularly receive complaints? And which agencies are in that category right now that are regularly receiving complaints, and then the others that are exempt from that?
I think I mean, I think the Department of Housing was one that we issued that had that issue. It was like, they have more of a process that is, they're supposed to go through, and there's a more delineated process than somebody calling the DMV because they're upset because they, had to wait in line. It's more of those types of agencies, and we can kind of give you an idea, and we didn't have all those, but it was an issue that came up, and that, from both perspectives, we want to make sure that they're getting their arms around, what's happening out there, because it might show there's certain blind spots in their agency that are maybe deficiencies that they maybe need to address more, put more focus on.
Right.
Um,
But so you're saying something where the DMV, which presumably gets a lot of complaints like, oh,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
time, or, so that's not an agency, for example, that would require, those aren't complaints that you would say are substantive enough to require a record keeping process, but with the housing authority there are. If you could maybe give us a list of the ones you recommend that are in the category you suggest here that sort of regularly receive substantive complaints, and they haven't been following up on those substantive complaints, that would be sort of good to know, unless you're suggesting this process just be in place for every single agency, regardless of whether
yeah,
they're.
that was not our intent. And I
Yeah.
think that one of the issues is not that they didn't, review the complaint, that not that they didn't, come to some resolution, but they don't keep it in one place, and they don't keep a record of it. And that's kind of the issue as I saw it. And I don't remember the specifics in that case, but I mean, that's kind of what we saw going on. So without that, it's like, when we did the chancellor's review, right? So if we didn't, the expense might have been totally legitimate, but without the proper documentation, we can't say.
Right. So would it be fair to ask every agency then to have some kind of protocol in place? Or would that for like the DMV become so overly burdensome for complaints that aren't really substantive? Do we have to consider, or would it be easier to just have a policy in place that applies to every agency?
It might be cleaner that way, but you might find that it gets priced out of happening. I think what our hope was that in those agencies where they state that they have a process, that they should at least be able to show you what the process is. And in some cases, they can't. So it's one thing to have a publicly stated process that works, and it's another thing to have a publicly stated process that doesn't. And so I think we were trying to focus, or ask you to focus on the ones where they had already opined that they had a process in place. We just couldn't verify that it was actually as effective as it should be, because you couldn't track it all down.
I
If
see.
we were to make the recommendation that it be all agencies, I think our concern was everybody's going to get wound up.
Right, that's what- that's my
They
question.
just,
Okay.
you'll get a fiscal note that's going to show how many full-time equivalents it's going to keep track of all that
Right.
stuff.
So if you can just give a list of the agencies you think, or the ones that have stated that they have a process in place that you're not, so, okay, I'm understanding it more, that you're not able to track because you can't track the process because it's not as publicly available as they say, that would be helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Representative Gecker.
Thank you, and great seeing you guys again. Just a couple quick things. Not more of a questions about learning about the policies. I am also interested in the special education on how we figure that out as far as the the audits would go, the performance audits, because I'm kind of lost a little bit on how you even would do it. I mean, I'm sure a lot of this would have to do with how the students are performing. Are we getting our true values out, or do you look at it more as the financial side of it as far as the investment? And I would also ask that if you have something in place also for, say, charter schools, to where, we as the state are funding them, and yet we don't know, is the school doing well? Is it not doing well? Should we continue to fund that? Should we not? How would that audit, or how would that performance audit work?
Thank you.
Well, related to the special ed, one of the other elements we might be looking at is, are there disparate charges for different towns for the same services? And there may be valid reasons for it, almost like a volume discount of some sort, or, but I mean, that's one of the other elements I think we wanted to look at. We haven't audited charter schools per se, and I'm not sure if we even have the authority to look at those entities. I know there were some scandals back in the past related to improper spending at at least one of the charter schools that I remember years ago, but I don't think we've done much other work in that space.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative.
Yeah, it was more of a question of just understanding how the process works, because obviously, I want to make sure that your office isn't inundated with things that are out of your purview, and maybe there are other areas. I know when people do ask those questions of us legislators, we want to be able to reach out to you guys or reach out to the appropriate department to get those answers so that we can answer those questions. So it's moreover of understanding how the process works. Where do we go with those questions? And thank you. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much. Just one follow-up question from that. If a charter school receives like grant funding from the state, I know that there is state reporting requirements that the grant recipient has to do. Does the auditors of public accounts have any part of that? Do they review it? Do you, when you are doing your regular procedures for the agency, do you review those sort of grant reports that might come to an agency? So for example, if we're talking about special ed, if we're talking about a charter school that gets a grant, they would have to report to the Department of Education. When you do your Department of Education procedures, does that include any sort of review of those sort of grant recipient reports?
In that example, we would review the Department of Education's monitoring procedures. So did they receive the audit report? Were there any audit findings? Did they take appropriate action to follow up with the subrecipient about those audit findings? So we're making sure that the state agency is monitoring over that entity.
So more of a control system and control, making sure that things are happening like they're supposed to as part of the control environment. Is that right?
Correct, that they are reviewing the reports and following up on them.
Okay, and the same would be said maybe for like a DEMIS grant recipient. So somebody who might be receiving state and possibly federal dollars for certain sort of, let's say, substance abuse service, coaching and things like that. You would just make sure that DEMIS has done that review process as the agency who's received that grant does their reporting. Is that correct?
That's correct. And we do
Okay.
that as both our federal single audits, if it's part of a federal audit, as well as our departmental audits.
Okay, that's really helpful. Any other questions? I don't see any online. I think you're good for today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving us so much time this morning. I know it's a busy time of year for you, and you've got a lot of big audits that are on your plate right now, and really appreciate it and your thoughtful testimony. All right, next on the list we have Ivalace Cordeya Brown. She's due to be remote, but I don't see her. Mr. Clerk, is she in the conference? Nope. Okay. Okay. Diane Lauricella is not there either. In the, nope. Okay. Is there anybody else that would like to testify for the government oversight meeting this morning? Going once, going twice. Good. I see my ranking member is probably juggling several things, and you weren't able to make some opening comments. Would you like to make any closing comments? I'll put you first on the list here since you didn't have opening.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to thank the auditors for coming here and for all their work they do, and hopefully this committee can continue to have conversations with them and discuss their reports when they come out, because they clearly put a lot of work into this, and I think it's important for the legislature to discuss those reports with them and hopefully take some action. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Great. Senator, would you like to say anything before closing?
Thank you. I'll just echo the comments of our good ranking member that, you know, really do appreciate the auditors being here to provide this information and that to continue being in conversation with them because, you know, they are doing a really a good job at oversight and it's an important function. And then this question of timeliness that has come up, with our committee, you know, I hope that our collaboration will mean that, we can add additional eyes and a timeliness factor that they may not have the capacity to account for right now. So really appreciate the work and appreciate the work of this committee.
Great. Thank you so much. Seeing that, we are going to close the public hearing for March 4th, 2025. I hope everyone has a good afternoon, and we'll see you on Thursday for our next public hearing. Thank you very much.